Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here to our event on urban tech after COVID, data and power in city life. I'm Jeff Green, director of the Andre Mitchell Center, and this event today is part of a broader series that the Mitchell Center is putting on in cooperation with its partner, Perry Worldhouse, on democracy and emergent technology. So far, we've had two events before today's event. We started things off in September with an event on propaganda in authoritarian regimes, and that was followed in October with an event on rethinking big tech. And just to give you a sense of where we're headed for the rest of the semester, after today's event on December 8th, we'll close out the semester, but not the year, with an event on race and technology. There'll be a whole other series of events in the spring semester. I want to thank Tom Shattuck and LaShawn Jefferson from Perry Worldhouse for all of their wonderful cooperation as we've worked to put on the series this year. And I also want to thank the planning committee that has been meeting for well over a year, envisioning and organizing the events such as the one today. And that planning committee includes Anita Allen from the law school, Michael Horowitz from political science, also director of Perry Worldhouse, Vijay Kumar, dean of Penn Engineering, Jessa Lingel from the Annenberg School at Penn, Susan Lindy from the Department of History and Sociology of Science, Benjamin Shestakovsky from Sociology, my colleague Matt Roth in the Mitchell Center, and also Christopher Yu from the law school. And last but not least, I will especially want to thank another member of our planning committee, Ellen Goodman, who will be our moderator today. It's been wonderful working with her in the planning committee. Ellen's a professor at Rutgers Law. She's currently on leave, though, from that position because she is currently working for the federal government, specifically as senior advisor for algorithmic justice at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration at the Department of Commerce. She's co-director and founder of Rutgers Institute for Information Policy and Law, and she's published widely on such topics as smart cities, our topic today, algorithmic and data governance, free speech, media policy and civic information, advertising, and digital platform power. So I just want to thank Ellen and the rest of our speakers for being here. We really look forward to the conversation this evening.
It says on. Is it on? Yeah. Okay. So let me just quickly introduce our panel. SHEILA Foster is the Scott K. Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy and Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown Law School. Ryan Judge is the SEPTA Director of Strategic Planning and Analysis. And Shannon Mattern is new to Penn, new to Philadelphia, the Penn Presidential Compact Professor of Art History and Media Studies. So the way we're gonna run this after we get your thoughts is each one of you is gonna give us 5 to 10 minutes of your thoughts on our topic, which some people might call smart cities, although smart cities is itself a kind of complicated and contestable concept. So maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that as well. And then after that, I'll ask some questions and then we'll turn it over to you. Right, Ryan, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. Yeah, so I think the SEPTA question back there, I was expecting a couple SEPTA related questions coming into this. I'm glad we're starting off with that. But so I'm Ryan Judge, Director of Strategic Planning and Analysis at SEPTA, and our department and our role at SEPTA is really to think about what changes in city life, what changes in life in general impact are on transit. So how do the way that people move and live their lives and get around, how does that change the way that we provide service? How does it change the way that we provide information about that service? And I think this topic is really interesting because as we look to applying some of the smart city policies or just urban tech in general to transit, it presents a lot of challenges for us. The privacy side is a really important one, but for us as an agency, a public agency that's been around over 60 years, we don't exactly change quickly. And I think there's a lot of lessons for us to learn from a lot of these tech industries in general on iterating concepts. Instead of waiting for the perfect concept to be proven, finding safe spaces to experiment in and play with is going to be really important for us as we move forward. After 2020, that's even more so important as we talk about the multiple pandemics that we faced, the COVID pandemic, the issues around equity that are finally getting the light of day that they deserve right now, the economic trends that we see right now and providing access to the opportunities across our region as much as possible. So what we're looking at is finding ways to integrate that into ways where we feel comfortable and confident in operating those as much as we can. So that's kind of where we're at. I'm really interested in a lot of the thoughts we have around the panel. I'll get back to the GTFS question because I have many thoughts on our challenges with that right now. But I want to make sure we have some time to introduce each other first.
So tech in cities, right? There's a lot to say. I think about cities a lot, and if one works in and thinks about cities, technology is unavoidable because I think technology can make our lives in cities a lot easier because the characteristics of a city, which are density, diversity, and proximity, complicate city life. So you talk about picking up garbage or making the trains run on time, or, surveilling the city, which is controversial, but, in terms of keeping people safe, across really to city governance, right? How people participate in the policy making and giving feedback to government, the rise of kind of city platforms and open data, right? If you want to know something about what's going on in the city, like a lot of cities are sharing data. So I think, technology is ubiquitous in cities, and you're the generation I think that knows this probably best. But then some of the things I worry about are some of the same things that have haunted cities throughout our history. One is, I'm sure you're familiar with redlining, right? The way in which federal and state governments and private actors in the real estate industry once upon a time redlined certain neighborhoods and made it very difficult for them to participate in economic life in the real estate industry. So today we have a form of digital redlining in effect, right? So you look at New York City, which is a super smart city, right? They turn telephone poles into wireless kiosks now, but yet 40% of residents in Harlem and other neighborhoods lack broadband access in the home, right? So one has to think about like who gets left out of the places where most economic activity is centered and where most of us are working and most of us will build wealth, cities. So if you don't have access to internet, you can't find a job. Kids are doing homework on, their phones outside of a Starbucks or in a public library. So I think a lot about who gets left out. And then finally, I think the other question that comes up for me is, who gets a say in the way that technology shapes urban life in cities? What I call governance, right? All governance is how do we participate? Who gets a say? So a lot of the stuff I've been working on is in the area of digital stewardship, putting communities, in particular marginal populations, more at the center of these questions and giving them agency in creating the kind of technology and ownership or at least control over data that they want to have. So I'll stop there. Those are just some thoughts. Over to you, Shayla.
So hi, I'm Shannon Mattern. As Ellen said, I'm going to be joining Penn in January, but right now, as the sign says, I have been a professor at the New School, which is mostly an art and design liberal arts school in New York City for the past 18 years. I just read before I came over here, there's a really great urban data or a data science newsletter that NYU puts out irregularly. It used to be weekly. Now it seems to come kind of as a surprise every month or so. And one of the main stories today was about a study of undergraduates at Ohio State University, students not really knowing or having maybe a very limited understanding of what majors they could choose to achieve the career goals that they wanted, or they knew they wanted to work in a particular area, but had a really limited understanding of what majors could allow you to get there. And I think that's the range of people here. And I think when you hear a little bit more on my background, you could realize there are lots of different ways of thinking, lots of different methodologies, intelligences that are very fruitful and can be very useful in thinking about this big multidisciplinary space of urban data and urban technology. So I'll just list a few of the realms within which I've worked. So for the past 3 years or so, I've been in the Department of Anthropology, and I was brought into anthropology because I'm not trained as an anthropologist, to start a new program on anthropology of design and technology. One of the ways that anthropologists, people who use ethnographic methods, sociologists, any type of social science researcher can be really useful in thinking about urban technology because they're great at developing methodologies for asking questions, understanding what communities' needs are. Going to Sheila's question about who gets to have a say in what technology is implemented. I'm not sure if SEPTA uses any type of social science research, but that could be one interesting kind of contribution to thinking about shaping urban technology. Where technology meets culture is really what a lot of the social science is about. So technology is not just engineering to actually be used responsibly, equitably in ways that serve or solve real problems or address real needs. That's where you have to think about technology as a cultural thing as well. I've also started off in media studies. My PhD is in media studies. Ways that becomes useful is to think about critical information literacy. How do people understand the data they kind of encounter in their daily lives? In what form do you present it to people? A map? A data visualization, going back to your question earlier, any various modes of representation of data forms, how are they received by different populations in different ways? How critically do people think about where the data come from, how they're derived, how they're presented? I'm not sure if that's a part of a high school curriculum as a standard kind of general literacy that's promoted. I would say it should be if it's not. But that's something that I think media studies, the forms and the ways we perceive media can be very useful in thinking about urban technology. Also, I've worked a lot with information studies, and the way that's often applied is kind of connected to data science, but also information study intersects with libraries and archives. New York City has been really lucky to have pretty well-funded libraries and archives that are really integrally connected to the urban technology community and to urban data and open data. And that's something that I realized the funding of Philadelphia's libraries has needed a little push over the past few years. I hope that they're kind of on the upswing. But if you think really broadly and ambitious about what libraries can be, they can be a space for people to test out new technologies, to envision the way they want technology, the roles they want technology to play in their shared spaces. So that's another realm. And then urban studies and architectural history. I've done graduate work in that. My work intersects with urban studies and architecture a lot too. So thinking about how technology actually has a material presence in the built world, how it can be aesthetically pleasing, how it can be cited in particular ways for people to engage and to encounter it when they need it. All of these are kind of spatial questions that I think architects and urban planners and designers can think about. So all these different fields, media studies, anthropology, social sciences, data science, information science, librarians, archivists, all should have something to say about urban technology, and they could all be potential avenues for you if you want to contribute to this space in some way.
That's inspiring. Let's maybe we can try to make this urban tech after COVID more concrete by let's just try to talk about data in a concrete way. And so question I have, and sometimes when we talk about data, we're talking about who owns data, what are the data flows, who do we want to get data, how do we want to share data or not share data. Obviously, there's a privacy component, but there are also kind of equity components and power components about who has power by virtue of having data. So let's just take one example, which is the Ring doorbell. If we think about the Ring doorbell, we can think about, and the camera that's part of that, all the data that's gathered in a dense, diverse, and proximate city because, lots of people are passing in front of Ring doorbell cameras. Some of them are coming up to the door, some of them are not. And so I guess just, it poses interesting questions about what kind of data should Ring be collecting? Who should control that data? To what extent should police departments have access to that data? How do we think about consent and what should the regime of consent be? Should it be a matter of consent between the owner of the Ring camera and the police department? How do we engage other stakeholders in those questions? So I just sort of throw that open and we could ask the same questions about lots of other data collection mechanisms, but I think does anyone use the Nextdoor app? that tells you about, is that what it's called? Nextdoor, that tells you about like what's going on in your neighborhood. So it's like, if you look at it, it's got a lot of Ring doorbell video on it all the time. You know, it's like this person, you know, stomped on my plant, this person took my package, or this person like left me a beautiful bouquet that was so sweet. Like sometimes it's positive things, but in any case, this Ring doorbell footage I think is like kind of is out and abroad in the land in the way that raises interesting questions about data governance and management and ownership. Any thoughts on that?
I think a couple of things. So first, I think we may think there's a difference between when government surveils and puts cameras around and collects data, because we can hold government accountable. We can make them be transparent with what they're collecting, right? We can even pass laws to restrict them. And when private people do it, private corporations or individuals who have a Ring doorbell and are capturing everything that happens in front of their house. So query whether that gives us pause on the private side more than most of our cities are heavily surveilled. You may not know it, but there are cameras everywhere, right? I'm sure in SEPTA too. The second thing to think about, I think, is kind of what our expectation of privacy is in a city. Right? So if I'm living in a dense neighborhood and you have Ring cameras and I'm walking on the street, do I really expect not to be watched? And, you know, and if someone's watching me through a camera versus their own eyes, how does that shift things? So even if private people are collecting this, is it the functional equivalent of peering out your front window? And why do we care now that it's technology? So all that's to say, these are complicated questions, and but with many facets that are worth thinking about.
You know, I don't think I thought about it as like a natural occurrence in the city, this surveillance thing. It's just the way we do it has changed a lot. And the question's really about access and what it requires to have that sort of access. And I don't really have a comment other than I think that's a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about. I will say, yeah, if you're on the transit system at SEPTA, like pretty much any other transit agency, there's cameras everywhere. There's cameras on all our vehicles. There's cameras in every station. And we have access to those at a central location. But in a lot of ways, it's really just a natural occurrence of city life. I think that's an interesting point. And that's, you know, that density of people, that density of activity and life is really what makes cities so interesting. And how you change that over time with technology is an interesting point.
I have to say Sheila's comment that, you know, we have always had eyes on the street. It's just they're of a machinic form rather than a human form. And I don't know if any of you have read Jane Jacobs' classic book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she talks about one of the things that make a vibrant, comfortable, maybe that's not a word she would use, but a vibrant neighborhood is eyes on the street, where people feel comfortable, just engaging, going about their daily lives, because there's always a sense that somebody's looking out the window or people are sitting on their stoops. There's always a vibrant activity on the street, people around, so that it's unlikely that you're going to be the sole person there and something bad's going to happen to you and nobody's going to notice. So just this constant presence, not necessarily people nefariously surveilling, but just happen to be looking around because there is such a vibrant, there's a lot of vitality on the street. There was something else I wanted to say that kind of slipped my mind for a second. One other dimension is, this was not what I was thinking of, but I will try to fill my time here, but there has also been research on things like the Ring camera and Nextdoor apps that actually cultivates a sense of greater, cultivates a sense of fear. So I don't know, in the summer of 2000, when there was a lot of looting, et cetera, around New York City, not as much as Fox News or other resources would make you believe. They kind of isolate those, they kind of highlight those isolated incidents. But I signed up for Citizen, the app that tells you kind of where things are happening. I kept hearing sirens during the pandemic and wondering what was happening. And I realized that just made me paranoid. It gave me a really horrible kind of, I felt a negative impression of in my city. I saw all this beauty and altruism outside my door, but Citizen app made it seem like I was living in a hellscape because there were alerts going off all the time. So things like Citizen and Nextdoor tend to highlight and amplify the negative and cultivate a sense of suspicion of your neighbors. It really does. Again, social scientific research has shown that kind of excessive use of these apps can certainly cultivate what media studies scholars might call a mean world syndrome. You assume the world is a mean and threatening place because those are the aspects of it that are amplified and sensationalized in a lot of kind of mediated presentations or technologized presentations. And I'll just, one final thing, this is what I was forgotten about earlier, is that rather than pejoratizing or thinking that surveillance is always bad, sometimes it does provide a lot of comfort for certain populations. So there have been some violent attacks in the New York City subway. I imagine things happen on SEPTA as well. One thing that a lot of populations who live in neighborhoods that have statistically had higher increases of crime to perhaps draw them back into the subway is to install more cameras so that people are watching over you. If something happens, we'll find the person, but hopefully knowing the cameras there will be a deterrent from even allowing something to happen. So especially in communities that have been under-resourced or disenfranchised, surveillance can be a comforting presence in some case. We don't want to think that it's always a bad thing.
Yeah, let me just respond to that, and then I see you. I appreciate that point, Shannon. And even since we're, at some level supposed to be talking about post-COVID, remember how surveillance was used in connection with COVID, right? Surveilling the disease in order to prevent it. And of course, that led to a lot of surveilling of waste streams and water to sort of detect predict, I think, also where the opioid problems might be, as well as COVID. And so I think it's worthwhile remembering that tech can be, positive and negative, and that's kind of really what we're exploring. And I will say the one other just reaction to what you all said is this question, which is, I think, really persistent around technology, is what's different now? We've always had whatever it is, right? We've always had private people on the street, eyes on the street. We've always had police who had access to various kinds of private records. One way, there's a Supreme Court case called Carpenter, and it was a case about police surveillance of a suspect, and they were using GPS data to GPS tracker on the car to track them. And the question was really, well, wait a minute. And the question was whether that was an unconstitutional search. And, on the one hand, well, that's always happened. Police have always been able to follow people of interest, right? What's the difference if they're doing it using GPS? And the court concluded in that case, there were other things going on, but they concluded, and they have this phrase, digital is different. And the reason they thought it was different in this case was just because it was such a perfect, right, tracking of and a sort of resourceless, right, free and cheap way to track someone. If you were going to have cops follow someone around like that, would be very expensive. And so therefore they wouldn't do it that much. And so, I think that's and when I think about the Ring footage, there's a way in which in some ways it's just eyes on the street of the neighbor for good and for bad. But in another way, it's sort of persistent and it's perfect, right? And so to the extent that you wanted to do facial matching or something with that data, it's different than if someone's giving you an eyewitness description of who they saw. Okay, you had a, should I pass the mic around or? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you, or you can just talk loudly, maybe we can hear you. Okay. Wow, that's the whole shebang right there.
I mean, that's like a whole course. That's her course, right? But I will say, I mean, I'm going to come back to it, and I think you said it, right? So part of this turns on legally one's expectation of privacy. You know, if you're in a private conversation with someone, obviously you expect it to be private. If you're walking on the street or even walking past my doorstep, not to mention coming up to my doorstep, do you have a similar expectation of privacy? And a further difference is it the government collecting it or is it a private citizen? Obviously, we have a constitution of negative rights. The government shall not. And the government shall not unreasonably search or seize, right, your belongings, including your data. So I think so much of the law turns on that. It's hard to answer your question. We can go down a very deep black hole on it, which we won't. But I think it's hard to know. And I think we're in this conversation because we're all trying to figure out what are the trade-offs we make in a highly digitized technological society, right? I read on Twitter or Mastodon the other day that there's a difference between social networking and social media. And I thought that was really kind of brilliant because the idea is that, well, we all got into this, right? This, you know, Facebook, et cetera, to be connected in a different way. It's the, you know, Jane Jacobs, Eyes on the Street. We're no longer in 1960, we're in, you know, 2023. We understand that looks different. So we all got in this to find connection. But what happens when you have these powerful media platforms, when you have a Ring, when you have something else, does that change the nature of what we think we've gotten into? Does the thing itself begin to eclipse all of the reasons we thought we got into the game, right? And I think it's the same with technology. I mean, none of us would dispute it. It's made our lives better in some way, but there's a law of diminishing returns, right? And it's made our politics toxic. Social media has not social networking. So I think it's a matter of what we're willing to trade off, right?
I think that point about the intermediary is really powerful because they have their own incentives, right? So it's not just you looking out at your neighbors for whatever incentives you have. On the consent thing, I mean, you know, you've got to go to law school. I'm sorry.
That's right.
You know?
Exactly. We gave you the 2-minute version.
Yeah.
Much more complicated.
I mean, it's such an interesting question, but you know, if you get on a SEPTA train, right? Like SEPTA has signs that says, you know, you're recorded and you're blah, so you are consenting when you get on that train.
Mm-hmm.
Then the question is, okay, if and sidewalk, something project both Shannon and I were interested in, and Shannon can talk about Hudson Yards in New York City, like all of these kind of semi public-private spaces where, you know, they might have signs that say, as Hudson Yards does, that, you know, when you're here, you are going to be surveilled. But if it's the neighborhood you live in, right, or it's a neighborhood you have to go through, are you really consenting? You know, are you really consenting when you get on SEPTA if you have no other means of transportation? So that those questions about consent are really interesting.
I just want to give one little anecdote. I wrote an article. I don't know if any of you know about Hudson Yards. It's like New York City's smart city development that was built over the train tracks on the far west side, just west of Penn Station, if any of you have been there. And I wrote a piece about it, I think 2017 or 18, before it came into existence, partly as a cautionary tale, like, look at all this data that's going to be extracted. Everything's going to be tracked. And you know, it was presented as providing a lot of efficiencies, but it was also cautioning people, are these the invasions of privacy that we're willing to trade off for the sake of certain conveniences? And I was surprised. A lot of the urban people, data people, kind of took it to heart, and maybe in the same light I intended it. But there were also some folks who read the article and then posted on Twitter like, this sounds amazing. I can't wait to move in. I'm like, that's the message you took away. You are clearly okay with giving up all of your private information for the sake of walking into your apartment and having it automatically kind of change the lighting and the HVAC system to your kind of preferred conditions. Or we actually took a field trip, my class, to Sidewalk Labs, which is Google's urban tech division. And one of the developers there took my students around, and their utopian vision they presented is, imagine you walk out of your apartment building, an Uber is waiting for you, a drone drops from the sky and delivers your iced Americano. And my students are rolling their eyes, like, that's his idea of a utopian vision, giving up all of your privacy for the sake of all of these conveniences. I would not really want an Americano. I'd want something different, but whatever the case may be.
Or an Uber to drop in front of my.
You know, I think just on that, like a good real world example that we talk about smart cities in theory a lot of times, but the data that comes out of that is being used whether you know it or not already. We use a system called Replica, which gives us anonymized and aggregate trip data. So all you walking around, whether you're taking a bus or a subway or an Uber or Lyft, we get an idea of where those trips are happening across our region. And it allows us to design our services and our schedules in a way that's based on the trips that are happening. So there's real world examples like that. The question is, what level of granularity is appropriate to get down to? We haven't been comfortable doing anything other than high aggregate kind of census tract level and really anonymized data. But it's out there and other agencies are using it right now. So we're running into another example with bus lanes that we have across the city. We have cameras on the front of all of our buses, and New York has some good examples where they use those cameras to ticket cars that are double parked and blocking those bus lanes and slowing down all of those people, whether it's to drop off your Americano or latte or whatever it may be. They're ticketing those people. And we're looking at those sort of concepts now. We don't have the legislation to enable it, but if we do, and if and when we do, what else are we looking at? Are we looking at street condition? Are we looking at sidewalk condition? Are we looking at other things? And what happens to that data when you do have it? And those are the real world examples of how smart city theories get applied. And as I mentioned earlier, as an agency that's been around a long time that is generally risk averse, what do we do with that? What is our role in that? Cameras for security purposes are one, but when you're tracking, double parked cars so that you can ticket them or not, or you're tracking roadway conditions so hey, this pothole means a bumpy ride for thousands of people going down this on buses every day. What do we do with that?
Yeah, about the citizen app. I'm from Philly originally. I've noticed a lot of people who come to Penn from other places and to kind of overblow the safety concerns of being in Philadelphia, West Philadelphia. And I wonder, I think to a certain extent that's kind of Penn's fault, and it's very simple system. Or if anything happens around or on campus, we don't get text messages about it, saying we're safe at this intersection. And so I wonder, is there some kind of way to get out of this people meal syndrome, where we're sitting consistent reminders of bad things that are happening, even though I don't 30 seconds. If something happened on 34th, I'm not up to the that. Is there benefit for me personally? I just feel worse, and so how can we get out of that?
I don't have the answer to that. But I also think that again, it's problematic, it's complicated. So the idea that if you're on 32nd, it shouldn't matter to you what's happening on 34th. It also matters, what is your realm of responsibility as a citizen? Maybe it's not immediately impeding your transit, but wouldn't you want to know if somebody just got hit by a bus 2 streets away? Maybe you have EMT training and maybe you should know about that so you can go help. So it's how immediate or how wide do you want your realm of responsibility and obligation to be is one question. Also, I imagine there are legal implications, like the university might be obligated to respond. Parents might expect that they're with their kind of open pocketbooks that their students are going to be warned appropriately about threats that might be facing them. I'll see if anybody else wants to pick up.
No, I mean, so speaking of social science literature, it's been pretty consistent over the years, whether we talk about environmental risk or other risks, that we are very poor. We judge risk very poorly, right? And I think these platforms play into that, right? We're afraid of things. And so a simple example of, I'm afraid to get on a plane, but I drive every day, when in fact driving is far more risky, right? So we misapprehend risk all the time in these platforms. And I think that's the point about these platforms, social networking versus social media, or this kind of platform economy where all the information we get, we no longer go to a central place, we go to specialized platforms, and they really do shape our perception of real life. I don't know that there's an easy answer of what to do with it. It used to be that we had other kinds of mediators in society of information. And I think now we're all left to mediate all of this data and information that we can grab easily from a lot of different sources. And I think that's just the place we're in right now. And so I'm not sure if there's what can we do about that? I don't know.
But on this particular example, it seems like it's a design flaw. Penn, for whatever reason, has decided to notify you of this. There are lots of other things they could notify you about, right? Like, I mean, you're going to be irritated if you're constantly getting texts, but, you know, and it reminds me a lot of social media, right? Like they, you know, until now, platforms have designed their algorithms around engagement. And we know that, like, you know, negative engagement kind of outpaces positive engagement. And so that's why everyone's angry all the time. And it's a lot about popularity and followers. And those were just design choices. And so you could imagine a world where Penn decided to ping you about, you know, acts of kindness, you know, that were reported to it, or opportunities for you to help, like a biker's down on 34th, like, you know, come help or something like that. So I think that's a lot about design choices. Wait, there was something. Oh yeah, I wanted to.
But you still have the Citizens app, right? Even if Penn did that, the problem is, would people then naturally be inclined to go towards the place that is feeding you this kind of doom data?
Or would you turn?
Right?
Oh, the
So you
rubbernecking.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, so unless, yeah, if Penn did the right thing, I'm not sure it takes away our basic instinct to go towards the
Right.
negative.
We have the problem that people are crap.
Not sure I would say that.
I don't have an answer for the people are crap
Right.
problem. I don't think anybody here does. But it's an interesting point, because the you know, the PR theory of you need 10 good stories for every one negative one is a really interesting challenge that we have, particularly right now when you talk about sensationalizing these issues and the videos, the surveillance that we have everywhere. It just means that there's more video evidence of things to sensationalize. And that's something that SEPTA faces as well, because there's cameras everywhere. Everything that happens is on camera. So when something does happen, that video gets out so that we can solve it. That doesn't happen everywhere else in the city. So you end up seeing more and more video SEPTA relative to other situations because we have 100% coverage. And the challenge that we face is, for every time we get one of those stories out, you need 10 good stories to kind of balance that out. So all of those messages that you get about a crime at 34th Street or 42nd Street or wherever it may be, you would effectively need 10 good text messages. And I don't think you want that many to balance it out.
I had a question about the replica. I mean, just so there's, you know, we could spend a lot of time talking sort of about vendors and how public agencies use vendors and sort of public-private partnerships, which SHEILA has written about. But specifically on the replica data. So one of the, I don't know if we would call that a digital twin, but there's this notion of digital twin, which is something like that it's capturing kind of all the, in any sector, all the things that are happening in the city. And then planners can use that to plan not just transportation, but like where, you know, where should you open a restaurant? Like what does the foot traffic look like? Where do we need more housing? And one of the critiques of digital twins or replica data is that it's sort of, it doesn't distinguish between is and ought, right? So it's like looking at where people are making trips, but they might be making those trips because that's where they have transportation. And actually you could have different patterns of transportation if those existed. I assume if you're also including, you know, scooters and bikes, maybe you're capturing a little bit more of the, you know, other kinds of pathways. But anyway, I wondered if you had a comment about how you account for that, how you think about that.
Yes, that is that's the challenge that we face day in, day out right now. I mean, we're pre-pandemic, our services were really designed around typical 9 to 5 commute patterns. So people working in Center City or University City in the mornings, leaving work in the evening. And we designed our system and our infrastructure, made the investments around that. If people work remote 5 days a week or 3 days a week, whatever it may be, that completely changes our ridership patterns. So replica or whatever equivalent of that sort of product you may be looking at is really helpful for us to determine as close to real time as possible what's going on across our region. So we know, for example, automobile trips are at more than 100% of where they were in 2019. Transit as a whole is at about 60%. So people are traveling more than they were before the pandemic. When they have somewhere to go and they feel comfortable and they're served by whatever mode they have available to them, they are making that trip. They're not choosing transit right now. And that's the challenge that we're trying to figure out. Why are they choosing a scooter or walking or biking or driving on their own or Uber, Lyft, whatever it may be? Why are they choosing that over transit? These sort of digital tools help us kind of figure out what types of questions to ask. They don't have the answers for the questions that you're asking of, is that the trip they ought to be making? So we have to supplement that. And the way that we've been doing that is good old fashioned surveys, good old fashioned intercept conversations where we go, we have real estate all across the region. So we use it. We send people out and we stop people and say, hey, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? What would you like to do? And we get really good feedback. What we've seen through that, though, is the people we hear the loudest from are the most privileged. So we launched a survey. This is probably my favorite example. We launched a survey about a year ago for our regional rail network to figure out what that should look like. And that is really the system that's geared most towards typical 9-to-5 commuters, people coming in from the suburbs, working in Center City. Frankly speaking, it's white collar workers, more affluent, more access to cars. We put the survey out, we did the normal digital launch of it, and we let it sit for 2 weeks so we could see what responses we got. And at that point, about 73% of respondents were men, most of those white, most of those affluent. So it reflected the ridership that we saw more so than before. We held pop-up meetings and focus groups in areas where we have really good regional rail service, but we weren't seeing the ridership, first off, and we weren't seeing any response in these surveys. So this is generally communities of color and communities of lower income. And we taught them, hey, why aren't you responding to this sort of thing? Why aren't you using this service? It's a faster trip for you. It can make your life better. And what we heard was really qualitative information that you don't get from any sort of digital tool. And it's that people felt regional rail is not for me. That's for the rich people from the suburbs. It's not for me as a city resident or me as a person of color. And that's a barrier that you don't hear about in data. That's a barrier that doesn't come up in any sort of survey question that we ask. So you have to have these good old fashioned focus group type conversations. And we paid people for their time. We compensated for it because we knew we had to remove every barrier so that we could get good, honest feedback. And that's the type of information that can complement the smart city sort of data that you'll get eventually. We can't ever sever the two completely. We need both.
That's just a great example of where qualitative research should supplement quantitative research all the time, where anthropology, sociology, those of you in design, participatory design methods can be really useful. And I think Ryan and I were talking about both of our interests in maps. I teach a class on kind of mapping as a methodology for students across multiple disciplines. And Ryan mentioned that he got into his field in part by an interest in maps. And I think there are ways that maps can be an object that people can think with and think through, because everybody likes maps and it feels at least you can draw a little sketch on a napkin. So it can be a really useful tool in a lot of this qualitative research. I mean, one way is to even look at the landscape itself as a map that's giving you clues. There's a thing that I think planners talk about called desire lines. Sometimes what you might have heard, Penn on the campus will probably place certain walkways for you because that's the way they want to prescribe you to walk across campus. But when it snows, you'll see footprints cutting across different ways, or you'll see people choosing other modes of transit, other pathways. So there are ways that there are clues. There is data in the material landscape that you can read that tells you what people might be what they would ought to do, or what they would rather do instead of what kind of has been prescribed for them. There's also a whole trend. I'm not sure if this is a technical term, but I've had my students make things called ought maps, like what ought to be there rather than what actually is there. And then also, I just mentioned, there's a whole tradition of feminist GIS, geographic information science, of women looking especially, not privileging the white collar worker who's coming from the suburbs into the city, but what about care workers? What about gig workers? What about people who walk dogs? What about people who are home healthcare aides? They have very different modes of transit that they have to use to do the type of a care and maintenance work, and typically kind of feminized kinds of labor. So a lot of feminist geographers have tried to use digital tools and analog tools to kind of capture those other needs, to figure out how to piece together multiple modes of transit to serve those other populations' needs also.
Sheila, I'm wondering if we can, since we're talking about participation, and it's amazing that you pay for participation, which is participation in tech or any other governance is often unpaid, right? So Sheila, I'm wondering, since you've had experience getting your hands dirty with real structuring real participatory governance, if you can talk to us a little bit about best practices.
Yeah, I don't like that term, best practices, because often there are a suite of practices that work. Some work in some places, some work in others. But I want to kind of pivot off the qualitative because it's connected in a strange way. So I actually think when it comes to understanding in a city, even in a smart city or non-smart city, people's needs and trying to understand, kind of what people have, what they don't, and what are the obstacles to people's full participation in technology or in ridership, that the neighborhood level is a salient unit of analysis. And often the way that I've engaged with communities, and I call them communities because it's often a geographic part of a city. It could be a 4-mile part. It could be as big as Harlem. It could be South Camden when I was in Camden, is to understand what's happening at the neighborhood level, because that is where people interact with institutions. They can be what I call anchor institutions. They can be civic organizations. They can be churches. And often, or sometimes government institutions. In Washington, D.C., in New York, there are community boards or neighborhood councils. And so understanding what's happening at the neighborhood level, and then looking for participation there is key. Then the question is, how do you take what you understand there and connect it to the larger ecosystem of a city and governance of what's happening in government? What are the choices that are being made, or extending internet access? So I worked on this project in Harlem to create a community-based high-speed broadband network using safe and secure edge cloud technology. And basically it's taking the cloud that is usually centralized and putting servers, cloud-based servers in public housing, in small businesses, and in civic organizations. And the reason we did that is because, again, 40% of households don't have access, shockingly. But also there was an important community anchor there, this group called Silicon Harlem that was already engaged in the community, that was already bringing kids in and teaching them coding, and that had a convening power to bring people together. So what we did was simply figured out who else we needed to bring to the table with this community, including government agency. Why do you need the government there? Because in the city, it's a heavily regulated environment. If you want to tap into the fiber and create a community network, you need the consent of the government. Private actors, Microsoft, donated dozens of servers. Researchers, usually at universities, because they're the engineers, they understand the technology. So it's never just, even though you need to go to the neighborhood level to understand the obstacles and do the qualitative analysis, you actually need more. It's not just the community, right? You need to figure out how to give them agency when you bring them together with others. And it's through that kind of what we call co-creation or collaborative process that I think you see a lot of innovation and a lot of answers to the digital, divide question. But it's iterative work. So that's the takeaway. It's iterative work. There is no one best practice. Depends on where you are and what's, what that landscape is about.
Shannon, I want to turn to you, and maybe we can go from the Ring doorbell down to the sidewalk, because you've done really interesting work on sidewalks. And I think we've all experienced over COVID how the sidewalks have changed with restaurants spilling out onto them. The double parked car and the automatic ticketing of the double parked car is actually a really interesting example of how, we're all annoyed by those cars, right? Like we would all in some sense cheer with surveillance and automated penalties for cars so that we are not stuck behind them. And at the same time, sort of automated penalties and surveillance of the sidewalk and of the curb can be dangerous. They can be discriminatory. So it's one of those double-edged things. But anyway, a long segue of just asking you to Shannon, to tell us a little bit about your work on sidewalks.
Sure. So a lot of my favorite projects I've done over the years where people will give me a keyword or a material object, and I just think about it through the lenses of multiple disciplines. I was asked to write this chapter about the sidewalk as a medium. I'm just going to read a little passage here where I talked about So I was looking through the blending of urban studies, architectural history, and media studies to examine the history of the sidewalk as a mediator of built space, a social interface where we're often negotiating various, especially throughout history, gendered, classed, and racialized negotiations. You know, who has to walk in the gutter, who gets to walk up on the sidewalk, who has to defer to other people. Sidewalks also a substrate or a conduit for communication. If we just look at the history of sandwich boards outside a restaurant, or using telephone poles to post notices of yoga classes and lost dogs. Myriad ways that sidewalks have been medium or a kind of a gathering place for different forms of analog and digital communication. It's also been a bridge between public and private spheres. A lot of our conversation has talked about the inevitable integration of the public and the private. You have to bring the government together. Microsoft is inevitably going to play a role. You can't get away from Verizon and 5G and AT&T, for instance. You have to use a corporate software replica to work with public transit, for instance. So a sidewalk is also a microcosm for where these public and private things come together. So the pandemic has definitely shown light on how sidewalks could be otherwise. We've saw that the benefits of having all these pop-up restaurants, sitting, stores spilling out into the sidewalk, which is not new. That happened in late 19th, early 20th century. Lots of examples of grocers, et cetera, using the space of the sidewalk to share their merchandise. And then wondering, is this always a good thing? A lot of critical disability study community folks were arguing that having all of this activity in the sidewalk really impedes our ability to get through on a wheelchair or a motorized cart somehow, or anybody pushing a baby carriage, for instance. So there are trade-offs there as to, if you're increasing accessibility for some populations, sometimes that means decreased accessibility for other populations. So all this interesting stuff happening during the pandemic, making us think about the public realm and the integration of the private. At the same time, I don't know if you maybe had something similar in Philadelphia, but in New York, we had a very popular initiative called Open Streets, which started before the pandemic, became very popular as more people needed to were just anxious to get out of their apartments and use public space. So we closed off a lot of streets permanently or every weekend and had pop-up furniture and turned them into public parks. Some of them have stayed public parks. We realized that we really don't need 8 lanes for cars. They can get by on 4 or go a different route. So these are kind of this shift between the public and the private. Also, not only have sidewalks historically been spaces of communication, but with the increase of surveillance cameras, the embedding of sensors, environmental sensors, movement sensors, shot spotters, a technology some of you might know of. They're kind of audio detectors that are often placed on utility poles to hear the sound of gunshots and then use various technology to triangulate where it might have arisen from. So the fact that sidewalks are the location for all of these things to happen. It's also a place where a lot of tech companies are doing some big business these days with the use of kind of ride sharing, bike sharing, scooter sharing, the explosion of deliveries during the pandemic as fewer people were going out and going shopping. Deliveries just kind of exploded. So the sidewalk, they realized that not only the sidewalk, but the curb specifically became a very, very important part of real estate. And the proposals that you can use technology in a way to optimize and monetize the curb to get as much out of it. There could be really great ways you could use this. For example, you could use technology to see what traffic patterns exist so that you could decide this street actually isn't used very much for delivery trucks on Thursday nights through Sunday mornings. Let's turn it into a park at those times. But then there's also something a little bit off-putting about realizing that we have to find monetizable value in every inch of public space. So again, it's that trade-off as to where it can be beneficially, equitably used, and where you actually are kind of just exacerbating the spread of surveillance and the need for everything to have a monetary value to be considered to have a social value. The discussion about Philadelphia is a city where there's a lot of street parking, and it sort of, as we think about tech in the city, there's a lot that's been written on the ways cities are organized around cars, and that, you know, the automotive technology was kind of, you know, one of the most important pieces of technology to shape cities and to shape that suburban sort of urban relationship. And so, you know, a lot of people will raise the question of
whoever decided that people should be able to park their cars and sort of appropriate that bit of the curb space, right, for their private car, as opposed to why don't they pay for it, or why, why isn't everything always metered? And those are really interesting questions. And it also shows how difficult it is to change, right? So like once people are used to having that permit parking outside their house, they really don't want to lose, it. Were you going to say something, Ryan?
Again,
Okay.
yeah. I think the curb management stuff and the streets and the ability to park everywhere is a really interesting concept for us. The curb management stuff, there's a lot of ideas around that. For us, it's really important because all of our buses are accessible. We can deploy wheelchair ramps, they can drop down closer to the ground, but that only works if we can pull our bus to the curb. So everywhere we have a bus stop there, it should be striped out so the bus can pull to the curb and deploy that ramp. But if a UPS truck or an Uber driver or whoever is parked there, we can't pull the bus in. And that means that whoever needs help getting off the bus can't get off the bus there. So there's very real world accessibility challenges with that curb management. And while we fight to monetize it and figure out what the purest value of it is, we can't lose sight of the equity challenges that are also baked into that. Because for us to really provide the service we need, it has to be accessible. We fight the parking challenges a lot. We push for bump outs in the streets so that we can put a full platform so that you can't park there. And that way our bus can pull up, it can maintain the right of way so that the cars behind it have to wait a second. That's our ideal world, but generally it means that there's some parking implications, which gets a lot of angry people most days. So that's kind of the world we're working in right now, trying to figure out what exactly that looks like and how we handle it. But what we talk a lot about internally is that streets are for people, they're not for cars. And the best use of getting those people at and around and to the destinations we're talking about is what we have to keep in mind as our guiding principles. And completely objectively speaking, transit's generally the best way to do that. So.
I mean, it's interesting because speaking of technology in cities, I mean, bike sharing, we haven't talked about bike sharing, but one of the things that I think really facilitates us using the streets, not just for cars, but for people in a way that allows them to get around efficiently, which is what cars purport to do. The rise of bicycling and sharing, scooters is really catalyzed through apps, right? I mean, if you think about City Bike in New York or whatever the equivalent is in other cities, you've got this smart system that not only tells you where you can get a bike, but where you can drop one off, right? And so I think that it raises all of these tensions in, cities now, particularly, and the pandemic kind of elevated them, right? Which is to say that our streets really just for cars or buses. The other thing that New York has done is close entire avenues just for buses, right? No cars, just for buses. And so I just wonder, like, who decides that? So I'm a big, governance person, like who decides what the city streets are for? Who decides how much we allocate them for cars versus we shut down, Times Square for pedestrians? And when we make those decisions, and I think this is the public transport issue for me as well as bike sharing, we often make them on an aggregate basis. We ask, what's the best for everyone in the city? What can get us around most efficiently, fastest, and make certain goods most available? And some people ask, who do the cost of that aggregate benefit fall on? And that is where I think we haven't done a really good job in cities, including with data and technology, of figuring out that balance between what, we might call aggregate, social welfare and kind of distributional cost. And you gave a good example, like you've got this beautiful SEPTA system that a lot of the people that could probably really use it and would help, both because it's efficient, but also lower cost than probably however else they're getting around aren't using it because they perceive that there's some kind of cost there, right? Even if it's just a perception. So those I think are sticky issues that I think the pandemic has really caused us to focus on, but I don't know a good answer.
You're not alone in that.
Yeah, no, I
I'm-
know.
I'm-
I just thought I'd
It-
raise it.
It's an interesting point. I don't really.
Yeah.
It's a really good point. I don't really have any comments on that.
I just also think the data drivenness of so many things lends us to prioritize certain values over the others because certain things lend themselves to quantifiable measurement other than others.
Mm,
Efficiency is always presented
Mhm.
as kind of like the goal.
mhm.
We always want to do things quicker, faster with fewer steps, but maybe that's not always the best. It's just that when you draw data tends to lead you towards efficiency as the end goal, but maybe quicker, faster, fewer steps is not always the most
Exactly.
equitable or the most pleasurable. But I'm not sure we're not all aiming for maximum pleasure every day, but there could be other values that you could be prioritized that would require different methods of collecting information and knowledge.
You know, a couple of things that come to mind on that point that I'll think of when CAD drawings got really common, you saw straighter lines in buildings because that's what the systems could handle a lot of times. There was a period in the 90s that I think is one of my favorite examples where one of the major sports apparel companies figured out how to make gradients in fabric. So all of a sudden that was all the rage on sports teams because that's what they could do. But they were letting the technical capabilities dictate what they were doing, whether that's straighter lines in buildings or certain fabric. And we can't let that happen in this sort of smart city world where we need to think about and really acknowledge the equity implications that aren't often as quantifiable as other things are.
So we have questions. In the back, there's someone. In the back. Okay, she has one. Sorry.
Generates a lot more data and a lot more digital assets. So I'm concerned about the fact that it seems that local governments don't have the resources and often don't have the regulatory frameworks to manage a lot of this or different resources. So I was wondering if you could speak to your main concerns or considerations regarding risk management from a state perspective.
I can take a stab at starting with that because we're dealing with it right now. And there's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is data literacy. You know, if we talk about all this data, you'll hear people talk about it in meetings like data is the answer. We just need more data. It's not the case. We need to figure out how to get insights out of data in order to really figure out what we need out of it, what the story is, what the insights are that we're trying to gain from it. So the data literacy part, particularly for a large organization like us, where we haven't used it the way that we're looking at using it now, there's not an institutional knowledge and there's not this growing portion of our organization that's focusing on it. We have some people, but not enough. So there's that side of it. And that's really important because the second piece is a data policy that says, what is our approach to the data that we own? What is our approach to the data that we're partnering with others to capture and store? What are we sharing? What are we not sharing? How are we sharing it? How open are we making it? And our goal is to make it as transparent as we can. We're building out a section on our website just to have an open data portal. What exactly we put up there is what we're trying to figure out now. The challenge with that and having really honest conversations internally gets back to the data literacy side, because you're relying on a few people that are actually understand what's possible with this and what we need to worry about and what those risks are. We have our payment technology SEPTA key records all of those taps that you're making on. So we get that down to the granular, I think it's a millisecond, and you know where people are tapping on. We don't know people, it's all anonymized. But if you play enough with the data, you can figure out certain things. And that's what we have to worry about. What is that? You know, what are we doing with it? It's all locked up right now. We generally don't do anything, minus a few summary analysis with it, but it's something we have to figure out. And there's not a huge swath of people that understand what the capabilities are when you talk about this big data set. So framing a policy and having the data literate capabilities to not only get insights, but frame that policy appropriately.
And you've also hit on, I think, the problems of capacity at the local government level. I mean, once you get outside of big cities like New York and, maybe Philadelphia, most local governments don't have that capacity. And what they end up doing is privatizing that capacity, right? And that's maybe another layer of worry. So maybe data literacy is one thing if the government's doing it, but what if the government's not doing any of this and simply putting it in the private realm, hiring consultants or completely privatizing it. And I think that's another worry. And I don't know that we've really dealt with that well. I mean, you probably know better.
No, I mean, I think one approach to that, you had asked about digital assets, which also is a really interesting term, and we can think about, it sort of implies property and ownership. And so it raises this question of, and so does the sidewalk and sort of public rights of way, and is data that flows across public rights of way, are those public digital assets? Are they not propertized at all? How should we think about them? But I think, one of the ways to deal with capacity deficits are actually institutions like this, like, anchor institutions and universities can really be helpful to cities in terms of pitching in and providing analysis and data literacy and partnerships. And Emily Yates, Ryan's colleague, who used to be in the city of Philadelphia and sort of convened an advisory group that had academics and others, I think, to help the city sort of think through some of these, smart city or tech questions. And other cities that I don't know about New York, but I know Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, because they have Carnegie Mellon there, and they have Pitt, and they have these institutions, and they have a really good advisory committee that's really helped them think about things like, okay, we don't have a lot of capacity. We've got these vendors who come to us and say, buy our tech, you give us your data. And that's a question I also want to ask Ryan, is like, private parties coming to you and asking for this key card data or other data, and how do you think about that? But there was, and I think we could think about sort of the aughts and maybe 20 teens as being the most active time here. I think before cities really started getting wise to some of these vendor relationships and the complexities. But for a long time, cities were sort of just hand over the keys. Okay, fine. Like, we don't have the capacity, you do this. Yeah. And then they started learning that was problematic. And then, but I think, so what some of these advisory groups and anchor institution contributing processes have led to is just a lot more sophistication about what should our data governance be, what should our data agreements look like, what do our IP arrangements look like, et cetera.
I just also add that I know Ellen and I have both written about sidewalk labs, which again, as I mentioned earlier, is Google's urban tech lab. And one of the reasons that their project in Toronto, the Quayside project, failed, some of you might have been following that, is in large part because of public pushback, because they had not addressed these issues. People were wondering about the integration of public infrastructure and this private corporation, who is going to own their data, to what uses would it be put. There was talk about bringing the public library in, which is a trusted entity. So they thought they could bring the library in to be a mediating force. That ultimately didn't work because the libraries are always underfunded. They don't have the capacity to do this either. But Sidewalk, the Toronto project, is a great case study of why it's so important to address these things. There are also interesting interviews with one related, I forget his name, something Ross, the big developer of Hudson Yards, where they put sensors and cameras everywhere. And there was promises of smart city. So all the stuff is there, all the data are being collected, but the smartness hasn't been turned on yet. So there are these people who have been interviewing him in the year since Hudson Yards opened for business. He said, we just don't know what to do with it yet. We're collecting everything. We don't know how to process it or what to do with it yet. So who knows what potential future applications there will be. Another one of those challenges is the history of Palantir, which is a Peter Thiel company. A lot of cities contracted with Palantir for managing their data. And then when they wanted to break the contract, they realized that their data was essentially locked in the platform and they couldn't get it back out. So this is where Bianca Wiley, who's a really prominent critic of the Toronto project based in Toronto, has said that procurement, which is a super boring administrative thing to think about, like who are you going to sign a contract with? There are huge political economic implications when you decide who you're going to, whose technology you're going to procure. It's not just a matter of I have heard joining Penn's faculty soon that Penn is really good at choosing dysfunctional enterprise software, as most universities tend to be. These are not just issues of efficiency, they're also huge issues of ethics, of political economy. All kinds of stuff are kind of long-term and short-term implications for who you choose to give a contract to.
Hello. Okay. Hi, I'm Jane. I'm an urban studies senior here at Penn, and I just have like a summarized question. But during the pandemic, I also have a car, so I tended to use my car a lot. And now I'm going back to public transportation. But I've seen some huge downfalls, and I've left feedback multiple times about either stops being requested and drivers not stopping, also chronic leaving bus ridership. They'll be waiting at the bus stop and a delayed bus will simply continue without stopping for them. And I feel like a really frustration from the bus riders themselves, because I am a chronic user of bus 21 and bus 42. Plus I've left feedback about even missing signs for bus 89, stuff that should be like, quick fixes that I haven't seen as much response about it. And I've left feedback online and phone. And I just want to know, like, what kind of data are you collecting that could potentially alleviate these type of problems that I don't see typically in the data that I study when I look at SEPTA?
Those are all challenges that we're facing across the system as a whole right now. When we're going through our bus network redesign process we're going through right now, one of the biggest concerns has been reliability. The ability to show up to a stop and trust that it will be there when it says it's going to be there. And if it's not, that you're hearing from SEPTA that, hey, there's a delay because of X reasons, like here's what's going on. And that's become more and more important for us, because if you compare that experience to what you would get with Uber or Lyft, you get what? The make, the model of the vehicle, picture of the operator, how good that operator is, their rating, and exact locations for where they are. And you compare that to SEPTA, and we're not meeting that same expectation or that same standard. And that's something that we're really focused on. But the challenges we face in a lot of ways are organizational, and what we face in terms of having the support we need internally, or the structure and the skill set to deploy those solutions quickly. It's a lesson that we have to learn from a lot of these tech companies, of iterating and getting things done quicker and getting these solutions out there. It shouldn't take that long to fix a sign. It shouldn't take that long to improve some of these sort of communications tools that we're looking at. The feedback is really important. It's something that we hear more and more about right now. What we're looking at is how we change some of our bus routes to make them more reliable. So every time a bus turns, there could be a double parked car. That means that bus can't turn. And this is where the things that we talk about from a smart city perspective, whether it's curb management or something else, that can make that bus trip more reliable. If we can manage the curbs better, manage the right-of-way space we have, so that bus, which has a couple thousand people on it throughout the course of the day, can be reliable. And those are the types of things that I think, as smart city applies to transit, or how we get to those solutions. They don't happen overnight, so it doesn't get at the challenge you're facing. And that's where our short-term communication strategy have to make up for that. And that's where we've fallen short.
Another thing I noticed about surveillance that I find interesting is currently at Philadelphia schools, you have to go, if you're in Philadelphia high school and increasingly in middle schools as well, if you're entering the building, you have to pass through a metal detector, put your bags in an X-ray, present your ID to police officers who verify it in their system and log the time you entered the building. I have two questions. First of all, to what extent this is constitutional under TLO v. New Jersey? But additionally, if that's actually like useful for anything, because when the TSA can't really stop most weapons going through, I don't think the school can either. And it's a little bit frustrating that at this point we have schools which we're legally obligated to go to, where we spend 8 hours a day under surveillance of security cameras in every hallway and increasingly in classrooms, and entering a building being searched in our possessions and our bodies by the metal detectors. I just wanted some discussion on that.
The question about the effectiveness, I have no idea. And I'm sorry that you have to go through this. It's what a world. The question about the constitutionality, I don't think either of us are con law scholars, but I do know enough to say that like there's a lot of freedom for schools under the Constitution to do what they think they need to do, including searches and safety, and including, you know, controlling speech and all of that. So I don't know, but I think they've got wide latitude.
In part because there's a doctrine that situates schools as effectively your parents during that period. So they're separate from other entities like the police that might search you, for instance. And the second, right, so that's one facet. And the second is that the Supreme Court has just got a lot more permissive in terms of the degree to which public authorities like the police or schools can stop and search people. It's just, that's where the jurisprudence is. It's part of a turn to whatever you call it on the court. So, and I think layer on top of that, the social phenomena of school shootings has made schools, I think, make this turn, whether it's effective or not, I don't know, but I'm sorry too, that you have to go through that. So more questions.
I think this raises another theme that's come up repeatedly. So not only are all of these policies entangled with the political debate around the Second Amendment, we've mentioned that when we talk about technology, like you can't think about SEPTA as a technological system without thinking about how it is impeded or aided by parks, by whoever manages street trees. Maybe there's a water main break that impedes a bus. So like all of the different infrastructural systems of a city impact the kind of the operation of all the others. And data are informing all these other systems too.
That's a really interesting.
So partly going back to the Hudson Yards, but also partly related to this is there's a lot of data that's being collected that either might not have a purpose yet or might never have a purpose, or we just don't know what it will be when eventually you guys decide to sell it to someone else, right? And so to what extent is it, or to what extent do you guys consider like only collecting the data that is strictly necessary for a particular function that you guys are providing? That's all.
You know what, we only collect what's absolutely necessary right now. So it's the cameras for safety perspective across our system. And it's the ridership information that we need either to make that fare payment for during that process, or it's what we have are called automatic passenger counters on a lot of our vehicles, which are just lasers that count people on and off, much like you get when you walk through a storefront so that they know how many people are coming in. We have those as well. That's like, those are the big pieces of data that we really collect. It's just how much of it we've been collecting over the years has changed a lot. And what happens with that volume of information. We're putting automatic passenger counters on basically every vehicle. That's completely anonymous. It's just number of people on or number of people off per stop. But 10 years ago, we had that on less than 10% of our vehicles. By the end of next year, we should have it on 100% of our vehicles, which gives us really good information to make sure we're providing the service we need to, but it's also a different scale of information than we're used to dealing with.
I just also say that, you know, this whole idea of collecting the minimal amount of data is also an integral part of the discourse around data, digital justice movements, and also maybe just choosing not to surveil, not to collect data when that's possible too. You know, entire cities have decided that they've outlawed surveillance cameras. So you can choose to not collect also. So this is a part of a lot of justice movements.
Hi, so I have a quick follow-up question about the idea of data acquisition and management. So when I think about our smartphones and why they're so powerful in our lives, it's kind of because of all of these apps that are built on top of an operating system, so be it iOS or Android, and that allows kind of all of these apps to talk to each other, interact with each other, and it's where the data comes from. When I think about smart cities and kind of what Shannon mentioned about the vendors just now, it's like each of these vendors kind of build their own proprietary systems that currently a lot of the data that comes up from those systems don't talk to each other. So it's not just an issue about how much data you collect, but also about how that data integrates into a bigger picture of system thinking. So I'd just like to hear about your thoughts on that, like how big of an issue is it today? And how do you see like are some possible measures to resolve that interaction?
It's a really interesting question, and I can't say that I've thought about it that much, but a few initial reactions are that, you know, in some sense, the open data movement that where cities should make their data open and it should fuel a kind of interoperable system of the kind you're talking about. the genesis of that idea was that it should be useful in the digital economy more generally, and we won't have these siloed sort of applicate. I would like, may I please have SEPTA's data for this particular use? And however, I think we've now learned that open data is a mixed blessing, right? And I think the same thing is true of fully interoperable systems, and which is the whole Apple versus Android, right? Walled garden versus totally interoperable system, and some of the fragility and security concerns that you get with and lack of control that you get with the open versus the control, but sort of competition concerns and exclusion that you get with the closed. And so I think, a world in which you had total interoperability so that replica was sharing, was interoperable or sharing everything with every other vendor, I think also would have some negatives.
I think I talked about it. Okay. This has been fascinating, and I am the professor of the course of the students from the public high schools as well as college students, and our course is actually about Latin American politics. But we look at like international, really the course is about how to be an effective global citizen, or what does it mean to be, participatory at the global level. So I think this topic really ties into what we're studying this semester. We look at some of the themes very broadly, like development, security, human rights, and you can think about this as a human right, right? And democracy. But so my question though is, in your research or in your practice at SEPTA, I mean, have you learned from other countries or looked at other countries that are really maybe successful in, with urban tech, either before or after COVID, or also smart technology, in part because we did look at, since we're focusing on Latin America, I gave some articles, and Latin America, and the articles we saw, maybe it's not always the case, heralded some cities like Santiago, Chile, for doing really great things with smart technology, even for sort of environmental resources, or like in transportation. And I got to see this firsthand, like in La Paz, Bolivia. That's amazing, cable car system. I thought it was like Disney World almost, but it was amazing. I don't know, if it is actually mitigating any type of divide, like where you see the divide here between regional rail and L and whatnot. So I guess my question is, do you learn from other countries, whether it's Latin America or other places? And then are there some places, whether it's in other countries or maybe in the United States, where you see, and I think you spoke to this a little bit in some areas, what Professor Foster talks about is this sort of Eleanor Armstrong's like common resources or common goods, right? Where they're better at that. So I like this discussion of private and public, and I think it's very helpful for students. So thank you.
I mean, so my team and I did a over 200 city, 550 case study, not just smart tech, but of kind of instances in cities that follow the Ostrome collaborative common goods, co-creating common goods, using often. And what we were particularly concerned about or asking qualitatively on the tech side was, or what we noticed, because part of it was an observation. Like, let's look at instances where you have these creation of common goods and figure out how they came about. And one theme was what we call tech justice, that a lot of cities were extending to very marginal communities. And in Latin America, for instance, in the favelas, or in, let's say, Bologna, Italy, in the neighborhoods with a lot of African migrants. In Amsterdam, for instance, they had very intentional platform policies around data and digital access, in which the state was providing access, right? So one difference, I think, once you get outside of a market economy like the US, is that the role of the state is much greater in making this almost akin to a public utility, or creating a platform, let's say, with the city. So in Amsterdam, for instance, they have like iPads or tablets so that people can give their feedback right in the subway station, for instance. That's part of their smart city. They also have a collaborative co-governance piece. So I do think there's a lot to learn, but I do think when you do that kind of comparative research, then you have to start thinking about adaptability here. And that is where, so when we do our on the ground work in Harlem and Baton Rouge and other places, the first thing one has to think about is how adaptable is that here? We don't have that kind of system here. We have elements of it. And so I think, yes, it can be useful, but there are limits to that kind of comparative research as well.
So we're absolutely looking abroad for other examples. We have, so our CEO, Leslie Richards, is also a Penn professor now, transportation planning, and she's really, over the past couple of years, pushed us to stop being so insulated. And we've always talked to our peer agencies, but talk to other sort of agencies that just have similar problems. And that's included abroad. And the reason why I'm here tonight instead of Emily Yates is because she's at a conference in Barcelona focused on this topic as well. So we are putting our people in those positions to keep learning and bringing that information back and trading in. So it's just one example of what we're trying to do right now.
And Barcelona is great on this.
I love
Oh my
Barcelona.
God.
I'm very jealous.
It's a great
No
city,
offense to
but it's
all of
also
you.
Great on the tech stuff. They have done something amazing. Yeah.
I just also say the whole icon of the dashboard, which is so symbolic for this aspiration for cities to have like one screen on which you can track every urban system, all the data being interoperable, to go to your question earlier. It's kind of a fantasy. They don't often work as perfectly as you'd like them to. Like Rio, the Olympics, you might have seen, it was a widely distributed, that image of a room with full of screens that created a dream that many countries around the world, many cities in the world then wanted to kind of aspire to that same type of centralized control. It doesn't always pay out or I guess that's the word I'm looking for. But anyways, that it kind of created a technological imaginary some people might use that spread globally.
Great question.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was wondering about the role of social media sentiment in collecting data to improve like city infrastructure, specifically SEPTA, because I know in some forums such as Twitter or Reddit, there are very specific discussions that go on. So I always wonder how those are taken into account.
Boston probably has the best example of how they've used it. They used a sentiment tracking for the appearance of how people were perceiving the transit agency up there. There's actually an advocate who built like a Twitter trolling tool. It so crawled Twitter and it gave out a smiley face or not smiley face emoticon throughout the day, depending on what people's perception of it was. We don't use a tool like that just yet. We've looked at some options. We just haven't found one that we felt like really reflected what we're trying to get out of it. But it's an important thing because the perception of SEPTA is the reality of SEPTA in a lot of ways. So if people perceive it as not being on time, it's not on time. If people perceive it as not being safe, it's not safe. It's that perception that we have to deal with and address. And social media information and sentiment tracking is a really good way to track that sentiment over time in real time.
Just briefly, I think it would be nice to come back to this whole transit GTFS discussion. GTFS, by the way, is the platform that allows transit agencies to share their data with apps like Google Maps. So briefly on Barcelona, having relied on their transit network while I was studying abroad there, noticed their GTFS network actually was really problematic. The schedules were completely out of date. Detours were only announced via Catalan announcements. And I think SEPTA has a lot of similar problems. And I was wondering if you, right now, SEPTA is very unwelcoming to people that are new to the system and not familiar with it, don't speak English, so forth. Does SEPTA have plans to implement very useful GTFS systems?
Yeah, we're rebuilding our entire GTFS feed and pipeline right now. It's required by the FTA that we have it in these standards. So we have there's a couple of versions of GTFS. There's the static GTFS, which is our schedule information. There's GTFS RT, which is GTFS real time, which is the tracking information that's available. That's where we have the most challenges. And then there's a third called GTFS pathways, which allows us to effectively build out a digital replica of station facilities. So you can tell people, go a left down this corridor, look for this sign, go up these stairwells, follow this information. You can follow that information. No agency has that really built out yet. There's a couple in a beta prototype, and we're looking at some examples of one now. But the GTFS is really the backbone of any sort of real-time information, any improvements to our app, any improvements to reliability. So we're rebuilding out a lot of that stuff right now. As we're doing it in tandem with a few other projects that are looking at the signage systems that we have and the nomenclature we have so that we're making it easier to use for people regardless of how familiar they are. SEPTA is a system that is cobbled together from legacy transit agencies that went bankrupt decades ago, and we've integrated them to an extent, but never fully. And a good example of that is how we talk about the trolleys versus how we talk about the Broad Street line versus how we talk about the Market Frankfurt line. They're one system. You go to most cities, they're just the metro or the subway or something like that. So we're rebranding all of those together with consistent nomenclature so that it's easier to make our GTFS simplified and consistent and reliable, but also for people that are new to the city to understand that it's part of a network. And you don't have to grow up in Philadelphia to know that all of the trolleys that run through the Center City tunnel come to Penn except the 10. Like, you don't need to know that rhyme if you're new to the city. You shouldn't have to know that. It should be a simpler system. It's like the Blue Route, exactly.